grow. So this one, we're in Esther, and we're going to be primarily tonight in chapters 1 and 2. So we don't get even into like the climax of the story, which is, the whole for such a time as this verse, but we will talk about that eventually. But as we look at Esther, here's what we know about this time period. For one thing, is that many years before this, Israel had sinned, not unlike when we talked about Gideon. The whole reason the Midianites were kind of in power over them, or just kind of holding power over them, they were still in their hometown there, but was because of their sin. So Israel sins, the Lord allowed Babylon, years and years before this, to come in and overtake Israel, right? So they are overtaken under Nebuchadnezzar. They live through several kings. Well, under Cyrus, later on, Cyrus the Great, right? He lets some of them go. We can read about this in Ezra and Nehemiah, right? If you read in Nehemiah specifically, the king allows some of them to go back to Jerusalem. They rebuild the walls, they rebuild the temple, and they are occupying Jerusalem, right? They've kind of restored some of that. But there were people who didn't leave. Now, the Bible, a lot of people read a lot into this. If you really just read it, I don't think that the Bible, unless I've missed it, which is possible, it doesn't really tell us. Some people argue that perhaps the people just got comfortable living in exile. Now this is not the Babylonian Empire, but it's the Persian and the Mede Empire, right? The Medo-Persian Empire, they would call it if you read history books. And so now they're under these other kings, and there's this other empire that's come in. They've wiped out the Babylonians. But there were people that just stayed. They didn't go back to Jerusalem. They're still Hebrews. They're still Jewish people, but they're not living in Jerusalem. They're not living in their homeland, right? And so that's where we find ourselves in the book of Esther. And as we get there, there were just, there's a lot of different things going on, but you had Cyrus, as we mentioned, and his grandson, his name is Ahasuerus, I think. It's close. Ahasuerus, I don't know. We would know him by another name generally in history. Does anybody know what his other name that we would know him by is? Starts with an X. Xerxes. Yeah, Xerxes. So most of you have heard of Xerxes, right? So Esther is living during the time of Xerxes. This, in this language, would call him Ahasuerus, because they, several of them, it's just like, Daniel. What was Daniel's name in Babylon? Is it... Yeah, Belshazzar, right? And that's just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is always weird to me because Daniel goes by Daniel, but they go by like the Babylonian names because they were like Hananiah, Mishael, and the other one. Things that you should think about before you say them out loud in front of other people. But anyway, so we're under, Cyrus was a good king. Isaiah talks about Cyrus. It says like Cyrus will be the Lord's shepherd. Isaiah 44 and 45, he will set the people free. They'll rebuild the temple. Those things happened, right? And Xerxes or Ahasuerus didn't follow in that same line, right? Like he wasn't just a great guy. He wasn't so nice to his people. Cyrus, if you just read other history about Cyrus, it wasn't uncommon for Cyrus to come in, conquer people, but then kind of let them flourish under the land that he had created, which some people argue could be why these Jewish people stayed, right? It was like, well, this isn't bad. Like we got good schools, we got good jobs, we got, whatever. They're just happy there. But he would come in, and certainly they were under his rule and his reign, but they had some freedom. They were just in exile perhaps from their own countries. Well, Ahasuerus is not this kind of man. And so let's pick up the story. If we just start in Esther 1, verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus," this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So we can kind of get an idea of that. I know some of you aren't good at geometry. That's a joke that I won't go into. We talked about places in the world one time in our class, and somebody in our class said, "I'm not good at geometry." And they're here, and I won't say who it was. But it goes from India to Ethiopia, north to like Pakistan, modern day Pakistan, like if you look at it. It says, "In those days," verse 2, "when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, and the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace." Now, we'll pause right there. If you go to verse 4, you didn't misread that. He pretty much throws a 180-day party. That's crazy. That's 6 months. You know what I mean? But one of the things that he's doing, see, there was this thorn in Xerxes or Ahasuerus' side known as Athens. And we know who they were. They were the Greeks, right? Well, who was the world power after the Medo-Persian Empire? Greece. And Ahasuerus had, if you read, I don't remember the historian, but they have like a quote. I don't know if it's a loose quote or if it's a real quote. But he says that part of his sole purpose, I actually think I copied it down, but I don't remember where I put it. Oh, yeah, I did. It says, I may punish the Athenians for what they have done to the Persians and to my father. You saw that Darius, my father, was minded to make an expedition against these men, but he is dead, and it was not granted him to punish them. And I, on his and all the Persians' behalf, will never rest till I have taken and burnt Athens. And then he says, whoever comes with his army best equipped shall receive from me such gifts as are reckoned most precious among us. Now, a lot of historians, even your biblical historians, will say that this like 180-day feast and party that they were having, this was when he's drawing these other people from all of these provinces that it mentioned and saying, hey, if your armies will come with me, and whenever we decide to do whatever we're going to do, all this stuff you're seeing, all the food, all the gold, all the wealth, all of my majesty, you can be in on all that, right? Like that's sort of what he's doing. So for 6 months he does that, and then those days are completed, and it says the king made a feast lasting 7 days, and this one's for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, rich, poor, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble, and they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. So they're having they're just like getting wasted for a week after their 6th month festival or whatever. It's just the king is displaying his wealth. I mean, if you go back to verse 4, it says he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty. Like he's just showing off, right? He's like, I have all this stuff. Look at what I have. Look at how majestic I am. That's sort of what the king is doing. So at the end of these 7 days of drunkenness and debauchery, no doubt, the king gets a great idea, apparently. If we skip down to, let's see, verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, right? He commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So he says, he gets this great idea. He says, you know what? I've shown all these guys my majesty, my power, my wealth, my riches. He's probably drunk, and he's like, I got a great idea. I'm going to parade my wife out here, and I'm just going to show her, how can I make him jealous? I'm going to show him how beautiful my wife is, right? Because it says she was good looking, right? So verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him, because this was like a spectacle now. He had told these men, probably publicly, or at least to them, hey, go get Vashti, bring her out here. And Vashti wisely says, why would I want to go and hang out with a bunch of drunken men, right? Like, this is not a good idea. And I don't want to get too off topic here, but there's just, there's a lot of things going on. But in this culture, she can't just say no to the king. You know what I mean? Like, he's the king. And quite frankly, most of the men in this culture would have had rule in a very real sense over the women in their houses, right? It's not like when I joke and my wife will, I say something, I'm like, I'm the king of this castle. It's just a joke, right? That's not how it worked here. So for her to deny him, this was a big deal. And his really wise men give him some really great advice. Verse 13, we talked about this last year, but it says, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. They understood things. Those closest to him, and we read all those names again, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti? This is the king asking us. According to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. She didn't obey his command to come to this feast. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king. And And I just find this sort of hilarious. But also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior, it will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. There probably already was contempt and wrath, right? But anyway, verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before the king, Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And here's the kicker on top of it all, verse 21. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. So Vashti pretty much says no. And Memucan's like, this is a problem, king, because if your wife did that, that means my wife can say no, and that means their wives can say no, and that's a problem. So what you need to do is you just like banish her and say, she's not queen anymore, I'll get a better queen, I'm done with her, she's no longer a queen. And then you make this rule, and that'll kind of put her in place, and pretty much then our wives will listen to us too, which is not, it's not going to work, obviously. But in the culture that they lived in, like, this is like strong for a queen to step out and do this, right? Like, she's risking a lot. I mean, she loses her royalty. And so they come together. They send letters out to all the different provinces throughout his kingdom, and they say this. And, of course, I'm sure they all listened exactly as they were told. But if we go ahead in the story to chapter 2, it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Now, if we pause there really quickly, if we were to skip down, is it verse 16? So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now, if you read verse 2, was it 2 or 1 or 3? 3 of chapter 1, it says that in the 3rd year of his reign. So you've got almost 4 years have gone by, right? Now, if you do, and again, I don't want to like read too much into this, but if you do a little bit of study and read some of the other historians around this time and age, does anybody know what happened in those 3 or 4 years? Some would say even on multiple occasions, but the king finally gathered those people together and went to attack Athens. And he lost a lot of wealth, he lost a lot of credit, and he lost a lot of influence, right? And so I just find it interesting. Like, I have this picture of, here's the king, he's banished her, I'm the powerful king, I can do what I want, I'm the king. And then he goes, gets defeated, essentially, by Greece. Now, eventually his empire's taken over, but that's not till Alexander the Great comes on the scene. And I have this picture of like him kind of like limping home, and then he gets home, and now he's got nothing. He listened to his wise men, apparently, and that didn't work out so well. These are probably the same men that advised him, go take Greece, who knows. And that didn't work, and he gets home, and then it says, after these things, I skipped ahead there. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti. He remembered what she did. He remembered how he banished her. My thought is he like missed, it's like when you come home and you've been like beat up, it's like you just want like to console in somebody. And wives are probably good at that, right? Like that's part of how this thing works. And so it says, so the king's servants, he's always got great helpers around him, who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins in Shushan the citadel into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen, the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king again, and he did so. So we have this story. Now, what we know about the book of Esther is it's like the only book in the Bible where like the name of God is never mentioned. Some people have even said like it shouldn't be in the canon of Scripture, but the Lord has preserved it. It's in Scripture. But as we read this, there are a lot of things going on. We know that at one point Queen Esther, once she's queen, she does call for a 3-day fast. But that's like all we really hear about like prayer or anything. So we look at all that's going on here, and it doesn't seem to be a lot of people that are fearing God, right? Like, we understand that. You don't read anything about anything like that. It's all just kind of the king's going to do what he's going to do. He goes and he essentially rounds up these women. And let's see here. In Shushan the citadel, verse 5, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, so this would have been like over 100 years before this, the king of Babylon had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. Hadassah would have been like her Hebrew name. Esther would be like her Persian name. That's his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So he's like her older cousin, right? You got that? And when her parents pass away, he's sort of just raising her up. He steps in and helps her out. So it was, verse 8, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now, when we read this, notice we never read, that Esther like signed up and volunteered to go, right? Or any of these other people volunteered to go. This was a decree, an edict of the king, and whatever the edict was is what went. We'll actually learn that later on in the book, not today, because even when he made a decree that he wished he could go back on, all he did was make another decree that would help the Hebrews defend themselves, but he couldn't take back his, because that's just not the way it worked. But it says, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace. I don't think this was like Mordecai, like, hey, Esther, come on, let's go up here, this is going to be great. I don't think she had much of a choice, is what I'm getting at, right? These women were already mostly